I only inherited an old car when my son died, while my daughter-in-law got a $65 million mountain estate. Days later, I opened the trunk and found an old camera. What was on it was enough for the police to surround her mansion that very night.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. From that Tuesday morning when everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled like old newspaper in the rain. The law office smelled like leather and disappointment. I sat in the hard wooden chair, my hands folded in my lap, trying to process what Mr. Henley had just read from Michael's will. Around me, the silence felt thick enough to cut with a knife. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Henley, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and looked down at the papers again. "To my mother, Linda Hayes, I leave my 2010 Honda Civic." He paused, glancing up at me with what might have been sympathy. "And to my beloved wife, Stephanie Crown Hayes, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including the Mountain View property valued at approximately $65 million. $65 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling the room spin slightly around me. Stephanie sat across from me, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the fact that we'd buried my son just 3 days ago. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension, and her tears had been carefully applied with waterproof mascara. Now, as the lawyer finished reading, she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I know this must be difficult for you, Linda," she said, her voice soft and concerned. "Michael always said how much he loved that car. He learned to drive in it, didn't he?" I stared at her. Yes, Michael had learned to drive in that old Honda. I'd taught him myself, spending countless Saturday mornings in empty parking lots while he practiced parallel parking and three-point turns. But that car was worth maybe $3,000 on a good day. The Mountain View property had been in our family for 4 generations. "I don't understand," I said, turning back to Mr. Henley. "The Mountain View estate belonged to my husband's family. It should have come to me when Michael died." Mr. Henley shuffled through his papers. "According to the will dated 6 months ago, your son transferred ownership of the property to himself and subsequently designated Mrs. Hayes as the sole beneficiary. 6 months ago, that was around the time Michael had started acting strange, distant. He'd stopped calling as often, stopped visiting for our usual Sunday dinners. When I'd asked him about it, he'd claimed he was busy with work, stressed about some big project for his accounting firm." "Linda," Stephanie said, leaning forward slightly, "I know this is hard, but Michael was very specific about his wishes. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of." Taken care of. This woman who had never worked a day since marrying my son, who spent her days shopping and getting her nails done while Michael worked 12-hour days to support her lifestyle. She needed to be taken care of with $65 million. "What about the life insurance?" I asked. Michael had always been responsible about things like that. Mr. Henley looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hayes is the sole beneficiary of the life insurance policy as well. $10 million. $10 million in life insurance. When had Michael increased his policy? And why hadn't he told me?" I looked around the room at the other family members who had gathered for the reading. My sister Ruth avoided my eyes, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the carpet. Michael's cousin Gary studied his hands. Even my brother-in-law Tom, who had never liked Stephanie, kept his gaze fixed on the window. "Well," I said finally, standing up on unsteady legs, "I guess that's that then." Stephanie rose as well, smoothing down her dress. "Linda, I hope we can still be family. Michael would have wanted that." "Family?" I almost laughed, but it would have come out sounding broken. Instead, I nodded and gathered my purse. "The car keys are in Michael's personal effects," Mr. Henley said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hayes." Outside the law office, I sat in my own car for a long time, staring at the envelope in my hands. Inside were Michael's keys, his wallet, and his wedding ring. The ring that should have meant forever but had lasted only 5 years. Michael had died of a heart attack at 33 years old. No history of heart problems, no warning signs, just a phone call at 2 a.m. telling me my only child was gone. I drove home to my small duplex across town, past the turnoff that led to Mountain View. The estate sat on 40 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, with a main house that had been built by my husband's grandfather in 1924. Michael had loved that place as a child. We'd spent every summer there when he was growing up, hiking the trails and fishing in the creek that ran through the property. Now it belonged to Stephanie. At home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, Michael's keys in front of me. The Honda was parked in my driveway now. Gary had driven it over from Michael's house while I was at the lawyer's office. I could see it through my window, looking ordinary and sad. I'd been a high school teacher for 35 years before retiring. I'd learned to read people, to spot when something didn't add up. And everything about today felt wrong. The timing of the will change, Michael's strange behavior in his final months, Stephanie's complete lack of genuine grief, the sheer disproportion of the inheritance. But what could I do? I was just a 60-year-old retired teacher with a modest pension. Stephanie was now worth over $75 million. She could afford the best lawyers in the country if I tried to challenge the will. That evening, I forced myself to go through Michael's personal effects. His wallet contained the usual things: driver's license, credit cards, $43 in cash, and a photo of him and Stephanie from their wedding day. They looked happy in the picture. Or at least, Michael looked happy. Stephanie was smiling, but something about her expression seemed calculated, like she was posing for a magazine rather than celebrating her marriage. I found myself studying that photo for a long time, trying to remember when things had started to change between Michael and me. He'd been such an open, loving child. Even as an adult, he'd called me at least twice a week, visited regularly, remembered birthdays and holidays. But in the past year, and especially in those final 6 months, he'd become increasingly distant. I'd attributed it to marriage. Some men became more focused on their wives, less connected to their mothers. It was natural, even healthy. But now I wondered if there had been something else going on. The next morning, I decided to clean out the Honda. It felt like the least I could do, honoring Michael's memory by taking care of the one thing he'd left me. The car was immaculate inside, which didn't surprise me. Michael had always been meticulous about his belongings. I vacuumed the seats and wiped down the dashboard, finding nothing more interesting than a few old receipts in the glove compartment. But when I opened the trunk to check for any forgotten items, I noticed something odd. The trunk liner was slightly askew in one corner, as if it had been moved recently. I lifted it up and found myself staring at a small digital camera wrapped in a plastic bag. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. It was an older model, the kind Michael used to use for his hobby photography before everything went digital on phones. I turned it on, surprised to find the battery still held a charge. The camera contained 47 photos. As I scrolled through them, my blood slowly turned to ice. The first few pictures seemed innocent enough. Stephanie at lunch with friends, Stephanie shopping, Stephanie at what looked like business meetings. But as I continued scrolling, the images became more disturbing. Stephanie in deep conversation with men I didn't recognize, exchanging envelopes in parking garages, counting large stacks of cash in what appeared to be a hotel room. One photo showed her at a restaurant with a man whose face I recognized from the local news, Anthony Marcelli, who had been arrested 6 months ago for money laundering. Another showed her in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by several rough-looking men in expensive suits. But it was the final photo that made me drop the camera. It showed Stephanie in our family's Mountain View kitchen, mixing something into a coffee cup. The timestamp on the photo read 3 days before Michael's death. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, staring at that final photograph until my eyes burned. Stephanie standing in the Mountain View kitchen, carefully adding something to a coffee cup. The timestamp glowed accusingly. March 15th, 2:14 p.m., 3 days before Michael called me from the hospital, his voice weak and confused, telling me he felt like he was dying. My hands shook as I scrolled back through the other photos. Each one told a story I didn't want to believe. My daughter-in-law, the sweet young woman who had charmed our entire family, appeared to be involved with criminals, and that last photo suggested something far worse than financial crimes. I drove home carefully, my mind racing. Why had Michael been taking these pictures? How long had he known about Stephanie's activities? And most importantly, what had she put in that coffee cup? Back in my kitchen, I spread the camera's contents across my dining table, printing each photo on my old inkjet printer. The images looked even more damning in hard copy. Stephanie's face was clearly visible in every shot, and the men she was meeting with had the unmistakable look of people who lived outside the law. But it was what I found next that made everything click into place. Wedged between the camera's battery compartment and the back panel was a small folded piece of paper. My heart nearly stopped when I unfolded it and saw Michael's handwriting. But it wasn't normal writing. It was the secret code we'd developed when he was 12 years old, during his spy phase when he'd been obsessed with detective novels and crime shows. We'd spent hours creating elaborate ciphers and codes, leaving each other messages around the house. It had been our special game, something just between mother and son. I hadn't seen that code in 20 years, but I remembered it perfectly. Each letter was shifted 3 places forward in the alphabet, and numbers were written backwards. It had seemed so sophisticated when Michael was 12. Now, looking at his adult handwriting forming those familiar patterns, it felt heartbreaking. It took me almost an hour to decode the message, my rusty skills slowly coming back. When I finished, I had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. Mom, if you're reading this, something happened to me. S is not who we thought. Money laundering for Marcelli crew. Property bought with dirty money. She's been poisoning me slowly. Arsenic in my coffee every morning. I documented everything but couldn't get to police. Trust no one in town. They have people everywhere. Camera has all evidence. Love you. The paper fell from my hands. Arsenic. Stephanie had been slowly poisoning my son with arsenic, and he'd known it was happening. But why hadn't he left her? Why hadn't he come to me? I read the note again, focusing on the line about trusting no one in town. Michael had discovered that Stephanie's criminal associates had connections within the local police or government. That's why he hadn't gone to the authorities. He'd been trapped, gathering evidence while being slowly murdered by his own wife. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Michael hadn't died of a sudden heart attack. He'd been murdered, methodically and carefully, by the woman who stood to inherit everything he owned. I called Michael's doctor, Dr. Peterson, who had known our family for 15 years. Linda, I'm so sorry about Michael, he said when his nurse put me through. It was such a shock. A healthy young man like that. Dr. Peterson, did you perform any tests for toxins in Michael's blood work? There was a pause. That's an unusual question. Why would you ask that? I found some things among Michael's belongings that concern me. Did you test for arsenic? Another pause. Longer this time. Linda, I think you should come in. We need to talk in person. An hour later, I sat in Dr. Peterson's office while he reviewed Michael's file. I did run a basic toxicology screen when Michael came in complaining of fatigue and stomach problems, he said slowly. That was about 6 weeks before he died. Everything came back normal. What about arsenic specifically? Dr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Basic screens don't test for arsenic unless there's a specific reason to suspect it. It requires a separate, specialized test. Could chronic arsenic poisoning cause heart failure in a healthy 33-year-old? He nodded grimly. Absolutely. Arsenic affects the cardiovascular system. Chronic exposure can cause arrhythmias and sudden cardiac arrest. The symptoms would build gradually: fatigue, stomach problems, confusion. The victim would feel sick but wouldn't know why. Everything fit. Michael's increasing exhaustion in his final months, his complaints about feeling unwell, his strange behavior that I'd attributed to marriage stress. Stephanie had been slowly murdering him, and we'd all missed the signs. Dr. Peterson, is it too late to test for arsenic now? His expression was grave. Michael was cremated, wasn't he? My heart sank. Yes. Stephanie insisted it was what he would have wanted. Of course she had. Cremation destroyed any evidence of poisoning. Another calculated move by a woman who had thought of everything. I drove home feeling numb. The photos and Michael's note proved that Stephanie was involved with criminals and had been poisoning him, but without his body, proving murder would be nearly impossible. And according to Michael's warning, I couldn't trust local law enforcement. That evening, I sat at my computer and began researching everything I could find about Anthony Marcelli and money laundering operations. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Marcelli was suspected of running a sophisticated operation that used real estate purchases to clean drug money. Properties would be bought with cash from illegal activities, then sold or used as collateral for legitimate loans. The money that came out the other end appeared completely legal. Mountain View, with its $65 million valuation, would be perfect for such an operation. A high-value property with a long family history would appear completely legitimate to banks and investors. Stephanie hadn't married Michael for love, or even just for money. She'd married him to gain access to the perfect money laundering vehicle. But Michael had figured it out. The photos showed him documenting her meetings with Marcelli's associates, her handling of cash, her involvement in what was clearly illegal business. He'd discovered that his wife was a criminal, and she'd killed him for it. I printed out everything I could find about Marcelli's operation and added it to the growing pile of evidence on my dining table. Then I studied the photos again, this time looking for details I might have missed. In one image, taken outside what appeared to be a bank, I could see Stephanie clearly handing a thick envelope to a man in a suit. The bank's sign was visible in the background, First National Downtown Branch. Another photo showed her at what looked like a construction site, talking to men wearing hard hats and expensive watches. But it was a photo taken inside Mountain View itself that made me realize the full scope of what was happening. Stephanie stood in the main living room, but the furniture had been moved aside, and the floor was covered with stacks of money. Dozens of stacks, each bundle neatly wrapped. There had to be millions of dollars in that room. They weren't just using the property as collateral for money laundering. They were using it as a storage facility for cash awaiting processing. My phone rang, startling me out of my analysis. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Hayes? The voice was female, young, nervous. Yes? This is. I can't give you my name, but I worked with your son at the accounting firm. My heart started racing. What about Michael? He came to me a few weeks before he died. He was acting strange, scared. He asked me to keep some files for him, said he might need them later. After he died, I didn't know what to do with them. What kind of files? Financial records, bank statements, property transfers, business filings, all connected to Mountain View property and something called Crown Holdings LLC. I think Michael was investigating something. Crown Holdings. Stephanie's maiden name was Crown. Can you meet me somewhere? I asked. I'm scared, the woman whispered. After Michael died, some men came to the office asking questions about him. They didn't seem like police. Please, I said. Michael was my son. If he was investigating something that got him killed, I need to know. There was a long pause. Tomorrow, noon, Riverside Park. The bench by the duck pond. I'll be wearing a red jacket. But Mrs. Hayes, be careful. I think your son stumbled onto something very dangerous. She hung up before I could ask her name. I spent the night going through Michael's coded message again, looking for any details I might have missed. He'd been so careful, so methodical in gathering evidence, but he'd also been terrified. The handwriting showed stress, urgency. He'd known he was running out of time. In the margin of the paper, in tiny letters, he'd written something else in code. S planning to eliminate me after property transfer complete. If anything happens, give evidence to FBI Denver office. Agent Maria Santos. Agent Maria Santos, a name I could trust according to my son. Someone outside the local corruption network that had protected Stephanie's operation. As I finally fell asleep just before dawn, I made my decision. I would meet the mysterious woman at the park, gather whatever evidence Michael had hidden, and then contact Agent Santos. Stephanie thought she had gotten away with murder. She thought she could live comfortably on the $75 million she'd stolen from my family. She was wrong. I arrived at Riverside Park 30 minutes early, my nerves stretched tight as piano wire. The bench by the duck pond sat empty under the gray March sky. I watched joggers and dog walkers move along the paths, wondering if any of them might be watching me. Michael's warning about trusting no one echoed in my mind. At exactly noon, a young woman in a red jacket approached the bench. She was probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and nervous eyes that constantly scanned the park. She sat down beside me without making eye contact. "You're Michael's mother," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you are? Call me Sarah. I can't give you my real name." She pulled a manila envelope from her purse. "Michael gave me these files 6 weeks ago. He said if anything happened to him, I should give them to someone he trusted. He mentioned you specifically." My throat tightened. Even while being slowly poisoned, Michael had been thinking of me, planning to protect me. What's in the files? Sarah glanced around the park again. Bank records, property transfers, incorporation documents. Michael was tracking money flows through Mountain View and several shell companies. He figured out that your family's property was being used to launder drug money. She handed me the envelope. There's something else. Michael suspected he was being poisoned. He started saving samples of his coffee in small vials. He hid them in his office desk. I found them after he died. My heart pounded. You still have them? 3 vials. I had a friend at the lab test one of them unofficially. Linda, there was enough arsenic in that coffee to kill a horse. Physical evidence. Finally, something that could prove murder. Why didn't you go to the police? Sarah's expression darkened. Because Detective Morrison, who was assigned to Michael's case, is married to Judge Morrison, and Judge Morrison's sister is Stephanie's mother. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Morrison. I'd seen that name in some of Michael's files. Stephanie's family wasn't just connected to criminals. They were connected to law enforcement and the courts. No wonder Michael had felt trapped. There's more, Sarah continued. Michael discovered that Mountain View wasn't the only property they were using. There's a whole network of real estate purchases across 3 states, all connected to Crown Holdings LLC. Your daughter-in-law isn't just a money launderer. She's a key player in a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. She pulled out a second, smaller envelope. These are copies of the coffee samples. Michael labeled them with dates and times. The arsenic levels increased over time. She was slowly increasing the dose. I took both envelopes with shaking hands. What happened to the originals? Hidden in a safety deposit box. Michael gave me the key. Sarah pressed a small brass key into my palm. Box 247 at Colorado Springs First Federal. The box is under the name David Mitchell. That was his middle name and your maiden name, right? I nodded, barely able to speak. My careful, brilliant son had thought of everything. There's one more thing, Sarah said, standing up. Michael wasn't Stephanie's first husband. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? I did some research after he died. Before she married Michael, Stephanie was married to a man named Robert Crown in California. He died of a heart attack at age 35, left her a $2 million estate. The ground seemed to shift under my feet. She's done this before. Gets worse. Before Robert Crown, there was James Patterson in Nevada. Heart attack at 38, $800,000 life insurance policy. Sarah's voice was grim. Your son uncovered a pattern, Mrs. Hayes. Stephanie targets wealthy men, marries them, and slowly poisons them with arsenic until they die of apparent heart failure. She's been doing this for at least 8 years. I felt sick. Michael hadn't just discovered money laundering. He'd uncovered a serial killer. The FBI needs to know about this, I said. Michael tried to contact them. That's when the poisoning accelerated. I think Stephanie found out he was gathering evidence. Sarah started walking away, then turned back. Mrs. Hayes, be very careful. These people have killed at least 3 men that we know of. They won't hesitate to kill you too. I sat on the bench for a long time after she left, staring at the envelopes in my lap. My son had died trying to expose a murderer, and now it was up to me to finish what he'd started. That afternoon, I drove to Colorado Springs First Federal and used Michael's key to open Safety Deposit Box 247. Inside, I found copies of everything Sarah had given me, plus additional documents that made my blood run cold. Michael had discovered at least 6 suspicious deaths connected to Crown Holdings LLC and associated shell companies. Men between the ages of 32 and 45, all wealthy, all dying of sudden heart attacks after marrying women connected to the money laundering operation. It wasn't just Stephanie. There was an entire network of black widows working together. But the most damning evidence was a recorded phone conversation. Michael had somehow managed to record Stephanie talking to someone about accelerating the timeline because the target was getting suspicious. The voice quality was poor, but I could clearly hear Stephanie saying, "Double the dose. We need this finished before he can contact the feds." She had known Michael was onto her. She had deliberately increased the arsenic to kill him before he could expose the operation. I made copies of everything and stored the originals in the safety deposit box. Then I drove home and called the FBI field office in Denver. I need to speak with Agent Maria Santos, I told the receptionist. Agent Santos is in a meeting. Can I take a message? Tell her it's about the Crown Holdings money laundering case. Tell her I have evidence in the murder of Michael Hayes. I was transferred twice before a crisp voice came on the line. "This is Agent Santos. Who am I speaking with?" "Linda Hayes. My son Michael was murdered by his wife, Stephanie Crown Hayes. She's part of a money laundering operation connected to the Marcelli crime family." There was a pause. "Mrs. Hayes, can you come to our office tomorrow morning and bring whatever evidence you have? My son warned me not to trust local law enforcement." "How do I know you're not connected to them?" "Because I've been investigating Crown Holdings for 2 years. Your son contacted our office 3 months ago, but he died before we could meet with him." Relief flooded through me. Michael had reached the FBI. Agent Santos was expecting me. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask you something important. Do you still have access to the Mountain View property?" "No. Stephanie inherited it. We've had the property under surveillance for 6 months. We know it's being used to store and process drug money, but we need evidence from inside the house. Did your son leave you anything that might help us get that evidence?" I thought about the photos on Michael's camera, particularly the one showing stacks of money in the Mountain View living room. "I have photographs of cash being stored inside the house, and I have recorded evidence of Stephanie discussing my son's murder. Mrs. Hayes, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're in danger. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again. Can you stay somewhere safe tonight? I don't know where to go. I'm sending 2 agents to pick you up. Pack a bag with essentials and bring all the evidence you have. We're placing you in protective custody." After I hung up, I moved quickly around my house, packing clothes and gathering all of Michael's evidence. I was stuffing the last of the documents into a suitcase when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw a black sedan parked behind my Honda. 2 men in dark suits were walking toward my front door, but something about their movement seemed wrong. Too casual. Too confident. Real FBI agents would have called first, announced themselves clearly. These men moved like they owned the place. I grabbed my purse and the suitcase and slipped out the back door, moving as quietly as possible through my neighbor's yard. Behind me, I heard my front door being kicked in. They had found me. I crouched behind Mrs. Patterson's garden shed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the fence, I could hear the men searching my house, pulling out drawers and overturning furniture. "She's not here," one of them called out. "Check the garage. Look for any evidence." I had to get to the FBI office, but my car was blocked by their sedan, and they would be watching for me to return. Mrs. Patterson's old Buick sat in her driveway. She was 85 and barely drove anymore, usually leaving the keys in the visor. I prayed she wouldn't mind me borrowing it for a few hours. The Buick started on the second try. I backed out carefully, hoping the men were still inside my house. As I drove past my own driveway, I caught a glimpse of them through my living room window, systematically destroying everything I owned. They were looking for Michael's evidence, which meant Stephanie knew I had found it. I drove to the FBI office with one eye on the rearview mirror, expecting to see the black sedan following me at any moment, but the roads remained clear. Agent Santos was waiting for me when I arrived, a tall woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me of my former principal. "Mrs. Hayes, thank God you're safe. We monitored police communications and heard about a break-in at your address. They were looking for evidence, which means you have something they're very afraid of." She led me to a secure conference room. "Let's see what your son discovered." I spread Michael's evidence across the table: the photographs, the financial records, the recorded conversation, the coffee samples with arsenic. Agent Santos examined each item carefully, her expression growing grimmer with every document. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "Your son uncovered the most sophisticated money laundering operation we've ever seen, and he documented multiple murders in the process. Can you arrest Stephanie with this evidence?" "Absolutely. We can arrest the entire network." Agent Santos looked up at me. "Mrs. Hayes, your son was a hero. Because of his work, we're going to be able to shut down a criminal enterprise that's been operating for almost a decade. What happens now?" Agent Santos smiled grimly. "Now, we finish what Michael started." Agent Santos placed me in a safe house on the outskirts of Denver while the FBI prepared their operation. For 3 days, I sat in a small apartment with bulletproof windows, watching the news and wondering if I would live to see justice for Michael. On the 4th day, Agent Santos arrived with a laptop and a grim expression. "We've been analyzing your son's evidence," she said, setting up the computer on the kitchen table. "What we've discovered is worse than we initially thought. She opened a file containing financial records that Michael had somehow obtained. The numbers were staggering. Crown Holdings LLC has processed over $200 million in drug money over the past 8 years, Agent Santos explained. But they're not just laundering money. They're also supplying the chemicals used to manufacture fentanyl. My stomach dropped. Stephanie is involved in the drug trade? Up to her neck. The Mountain View property isn't just a storage facility for cash. There's a chemical processing lab in the basement that your son photographed. They've been using your family's historic estate as a drug manufacturing center. She showed me photos that Michael had somehow taken of the basement. Equipment I didn't recognize filled what used to be my husband's workshop. Men in hazmat suits worked over complex machinery, processing chemicals into powder. How long has this been going on? We think it started about 2 years ago, shortly after Stephanie married your son. She needed the property for its remote location and large basement. Marrying Michael gave her legal access to the perfect facility. The violation felt personal and devastating. My husband's family had built that house as a retreat from the world, a place of peace and natural beauty. Stephanie had turned it into a poison factory. There's something else, Agent Santos continued. We've identified at least 12 women working with Stephanie. They target wealthy men across multiple states, marry them, and either slowly poison them or use their properties for criminal activities, sometimes both. She showed me photographs of women who looked remarkably similar to Stephanie, blonde, attractive, young. Each had been married to men who died under suspicious circumstances. It's a systematic operation. They recruit women with acting backgrounds or criminal experience, train them to infiltrate wealthy families, and then either harvest the inheritance or use the properties for drug operations. Your daughter-in-law was one of their most successful operators. How many men have they killed? Agent Santos consulted her notes. We've confirmed 18 suspicious deaths across 7 states. All men between 32 and 48, all married to women connected to this network, all died of apparent heart attacks caused by arsenic poisoning. 18 men, 18 families destroyed by these monsters, and Michael had discovered it all. We need your help with the final phase of the operation, Agent Santos said. Tomorrow night, we're going to raid Mountain View and arrest everyone involved, but we need someone inside the house to confirm the location of the chemical lab and identify key players. You want me to go back there? We want you to wear a wire and visit Stephanie. Act like a grieving mother-in-law who wants to collect some of Michael's belongings. Once you're inside, you can guide our surveillance team to the areas where evidence is located. The thought of facing Stephanie, knowing what she'd done to Michael, made me feel sick. But it was also what my son would have wanted. What if she suspects something? We'll have agents positioned all around the property. If anything goes wrong, we can be inside within seconds. Agent Santos leaned forward. Mrs. Hayes, without your help, some of these people might escape. They're planning to abandon the Mountain View operation and move to a new location. This is our only chance to get them all. I thought about Michael, lying in his hospital bed in those final hours, confused and frightened by what was happening to his body. Stephanie had sat beside him, holding his hand, playing the devoted wife while knowing she had poisoned him. I'll do it. The next evening, I drove up the familiar winding road to Mountain View, my heart pounding against the wire taped to my chest. The house looked exactly as it always had from the outside, a beautiful log structure nestled among pine trees, with warm light glowing in the windows. But knowing what was happening inside made it look sinister. Stephanie answered the door wearing black yoga pants and a cashmere sweater. She looked surprised to see me, but quickly rearranged her features into an expression of concern. Linda, what a surprise. Come in, please. The living room had been returned to normal since Michael's photos were taken. No stacks of money, no evidence of criminal activity, just expensive furniture and tasteful artwork. I'm sorry to bother you, I said, following the script Agent Santos had coached me on. I was hoping I could collect a few of Michael's personal things, photos, maybe some of his books. Of course, Stephanie said, though I caught a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. Most of his things are still in his study upstairs. Can I get you some coffee? Coffee. The beverage she'd used to poison my son for months. That would be lovely. While Stephanie went to the kitchen, I moved around the living room, speaking quietly to the listening device. Living room appears normal. No visible evidence of storage activities. Moving toward the stairs, I climbed to the second floor, remembering all the times I'd walked these halls as a child visiting my grandparents. Michael's study was exactly as he'd left it. Neat, organized, with his diplomas on the wall and family photos on the desk. But as I looked through his belongings, I noticed something strange. His computer was missing. So were his filing cabinets. The desk drawers were empty. "They've cleared out all of Michael's records," I whispered to the wire. "Linda," Stephanie's voice came from downstairs. "Your coffee is ready." I made my way back to the living room, where Stephanie had set out a tray with coffee cups and pastries. She poured from an ornate silver pot that had belonged to my mother-in-law. "I hope you don't mind that I've been redecorating," Stephanie said, settling into the chair across from me. "It helps with the grieving process. I understand. It must be difficult for you here." Stephanie's smile seemed forced. "Some days are harder than others, but Michael would want me to move forward with my life." As we talked, I heard sounds from somewhere below us, muffled voices, the hum of machinery. The basement operation was active. "Is there construction going on downstairs?" I asked. Stephanie's hand paused as she reached for her coffee cup. "Just some repairs. The basement flooded last month and we're dealing with water damage." A lie. I knew the basement had never flooded. "Could I use the bathroom?" I asked. "Of course. You know where it is." Instead of going to the main floor bathroom, I slipped down the back staircase that led to the basement. The sounds grew louder as I descended. Voices, chemical processing equipment, the whir of ventilation fans. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself looking into my worst nightmare. The basement had been completely transformed into a sophisticated laboratory. Men in white coats worked at stations processing chemicals into powder. Massive ventilation systems had been installed to handle toxic fumes. Tables covered with drug manufacturing equipment filled the space where my husband used to keep his woodworking tools. "Processing lab confirmed in basement," I whispered to the wire. "Multiple subjects involved in drug manufacturing." "Linda?" I spun around to find Stephanie standing at the top of the stairs, her expression no longer friendly. "What are you doing down there?" "I got lost," I said, climbing back up quickly. "I was looking for the bathroom, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. And when I reached the top of the stairs, I saw why." A man stood beside Stephanie, the same man from Michael's photos who had been meeting with her in parking garages. He was large, muscular, with cold eyes that assessed me like a threat to be eliminated. "This is my friend Tony," Stephanie said. "He's been helping me with some business matters." Tony stepped forward, blocking my path to the front door. "Mrs. Hayes," he said in a voice like gravel, "I think we need to have a conversation." I realized with growing terror that my cover was blown. Somehow they knew I was working with the FBI. "I should really be going," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't think so," Tony replied. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. "You see, we know you've been talking to federal agents. We know you have your son's evidence." Stephanie's mask had completely fallen away. The sweet, grieving widow was gone, replaced by someone with eyes like ice. "You always were a nosy old woman," she said. "Just like your son. He couldn't leave well enough alone either. Michael was a good man. He was trying to stop you from hurting people. Michael was a liability, just like you." Stephanie nodded to Tony. "Take her downstairs. Make it look like an accident." Tony grabbed my arm, but before he could move me toward the basement, the front door exploded inward. "FBI, hands up!" Agent Santos led a team of federal agents into the house, weapons drawn. Through the windows, I could see tactical teams surrounding the property. Tony released me and reached for his gun, but Agent Santos was faster. "Drop the weapon! Now!" More agents poured through the back entrance, sealing off all escape routes. From the basement came shouts and the sound of equipment being overturned as the lab was raided. Stephanie stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her face white with shock and rage. "Stephanie Crown Hayes," Agent Santos announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and drug trafficking." As the agents handcuffed Stephanie, she looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You have no idea how big this organization is." But I wasn't afraid anymore. Michael's evidence had done its work. The network that had killed my son was finally being destroyed. "It's over for you," I told her quietly. Michael made sure of that. The next 3 months passed in a blur of FBI interviews, grand jury testimonies, and legal proceedings. I spent most of that time in protective custody as the investigation unraveled the full scope of the criminal network Stephanie had been part of. Agent Santos visited me regularly to update me on their progress. The news was both devastating and vindicating. "We've arrested 43 people across 7 states," she told me during one of our meetings. "The organization was even larger than we thought. They've been operating for 12 years, not 8. The evidence Michael had gathered proved to be the key that unlocked everything. His photographs, financial records, and coded notes led investigators to bank accounts, shell companies, and properties across the country. Most importantly, his documentation of the chemical lab allowed federal agents to trace the supply chain that had been flooding the streets with fentanyl. "Your son saved countless lives," Agent Santos said. "The drugs being manufactured at Mountain View were destined for distribution across the entire western United States. Shutting down that operation prevented thousands of overdoses. But it was the personal justice that meant the most to me. The coffee samples Michael had hidden tested positive for lethal levels of arsenic. Combined with his photographs and recorded conversations, the evidence was overwhelming. "Stephanie has agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a plea deal," Agent Santos informed me. "She'll serve 25 years to life, but she's giving us information about the entire network. 25 years to life. It wasn't enough for taking Michael's life, but it meant she would never hurt another innocent person. What about the other victims? The other men she and her associates killed? We're reopening all 18 cases. With Stephanie's cooperation and the evidence your son gathered, we expect to file murder charges in at least 15 of them." The preliminary hearings began in August. I sat in the federal courthouse in Denver, watching as Stephanie was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. She looked smaller now, diminished. The confident woman who had charmed my family was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her life of crime was over. When she was asked to enter her plea, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Guilty, Your Honor, to all charges." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, looked down at Stephanie with obvious distaste. "Mrs. Hayes, you have pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder, money laundering, drug trafficking, and racketeering. Do you understand that these charges carry a maximum penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting to the premeditated murder of your husband, Michael Hayes, through the systematic administration of arsenic poison over a period of 6 months?" Stephanie's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." Hearing her finally admit what she'd done to Michael brought tears to my eyes, not tears of sadness, but of relief. My son's death was officially recognized as the murder it had been. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for September. In the weeks leading up to it, I was asked to prepare a victim impact statement. I spent hours writing and rewriting it, trying to find words that could express what Michael had meant to me and to the world. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed with families of Stephanie's other victims. I recognized some of them from newspaper articles about the investigation. Mothers, fathers, siblings, children. All people whose lives had been shattered by the same network that had killed my son. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium with Michael's photograph in my hand. "Your Honor, my son Michael was 33 years old when Stephanie Hayes murdered him. He was an accountant. A good man who paid his taxes and helped his neighbors and called his mother twice a week." I looked directly at Stephanie as I spoke. She stared at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. Michael discovered that his wife was a criminal, and instead of protecting himself, he chose to gather evidence that would protect others. He knew she was poisoning him, but he continued documenting her crimes because he knew other families were at risk. My voice grew stronger as I continued. "Stephanie, you took my only child from me. You stole the grandchildren I'll never have, the family gatherings that will never happen, the phone calls on Sunday mornings that were the brightest part of my week. But you didn't just take Michael from me. You took him from every life he would have touched, every person he would have helped, every good thing he would have done in this world." I held up his photograph. "This is Michael Hayes. He was a hero who died trying to stop you from hurting other people. Because of his courage and sacrifice, you will never murder another innocent person. That is his legacy, and it's more powerful than anything you could ever destroy." When I finished, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of quiet crying from other victims' families. Judge Morrison, no relation to the corrupt local judge who had protected Stephanie's network, delivered the sentence with stern finality. "Mrs. Hayes, You have committed some of the most heinous crimes this court has ever seen. You systematically targeted, manipulated, and murdered innocent people for financial gain. Your actions have destroyed families and contributed to a drug epidemic that has claimed thousands of lives. She paused, looking directly at Stephanie. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, plus an additional 40 years for drug trafficking and racketeering. These sentences will run consecutively. Life without parole, plus 40 years. Stephanie would die in prison. As the bailiffs led her away, Stephanie turned back toward the gallery one last time. Her eyes found mine, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been remorse, but it was too late for apologies. After the sentencing, Agent Santos walked me to my car. What happens now? I asked. Now we finish prosecuting the rest of the network. Your son's evidence is helping us build cases against 37 other defendants. This investigation will be ongoing for at least another year. And the Mountain View property? It's been seized as evidence and will eventually be returned to your family once the legal proceedings are complete. The government will also be responsible for cleaning up and restoring the property. Mountain View, my family's beautiful retreat, poisoned by Stephanie's crimes. I wasn't sure I could ever live there again, knowing what had happened in the basement, Mrs. Hayes, Agent Santos continued. I want you to know that your son's investigation was one of the most thorough and professional pieces of police work I've ever seen. He would have made an excellent federal agent. The compliment meant more to me than she could have known. Michael had always been interested in law enforcement as a young man, before he'd chosen accounting as a more stable career. 3 months later, I stood in the Mountain View living room for the first time since the night of Stephanie's arrest. The FBI had finished processing the scene, and environmental specialists had cleaned up the basement laboratory. The house looked exactly as it had when my husband's family owned it, but something essential had been lost. I walked through the rooms slowly, remembering Michael as a child playing hide-and-seek in these halls, reading books by the fireplace, learning to fish in the creek behind the house. Those memories felt sacred now, too precious to be contaminated by what Stephanie had done here. In Michael's old bedroom, I found something the FBI had missed, a small wooden box hidden behind loose baseboards. Inside were more of his childhood treasures, baseball cards, toy soldiers, a letter I'd written him when he went away to college. At the bottom of the box was an envelope with my name on it, written in Michael's adult handwriting. Inside was a letter dated 2 weeks before his death. Mom, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me and you've discovered the truth about Stephanie. I know this must be incredibly painful for you, and I'm sorry you had to go through this alone. I want you to know that I tried to leave her as soon as I figured out what she was doing, but they threatened to hurt you if I left or went to the police. I couldn't risk your safety, so I decided to gather enough evidence to put them all in prison where they could never hurt anyone again. I know you're probably angry that I didn't come to you for help, but you taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. That's what I'm trying to do. Please don't blame yourself for any of this. Stephanie fooled all of us because she's a professional criminal. This wasn't your fault or mine. It was hers. I love you, Mom. Take care of yourself, and don't let anger consume you. Use this experience to help other people if you can. Your son, Michael. I sat in that empty bedroom and cried for the first time since Michael's death. Not tears of anger or grief, but tears of pride. My son had faced an impossible situation and chosen to sacrifice himself to protect others. He had been braver than I ever could have imagined. When I finally stopped crying, I made my decision about Mountain View. I would donate the property to the FBI to be used as a training facility for agents investigating financial crimes. Michael's courage would help train the next generation of law enforcement officers. It felt like the right way to honor his memory. 2 years after Stephanie's sentencing, I stood in the lobby of the Michael Hayes Center for Financial Crime Investigation, watching FBI trainees study the case files displayed on the memorial wall. My son's photograph hung in the center, surrounded by documentation of the investigation that had brought down one of the largest money laundering operations in federal history. Mrs. Hayes? A young woman approached me, her badge identifying her as Special Agent Rebecca Chen. I'm graduating from the program today. I wanted to thank you for your son's work. His investigative methods are part of our core curriculum now. I smiled, feeling the familiar mix of pride and sadness that came with these encounters. Michael would be honored to know he's helping train agents like you. His techniques for tracking financial flows through shell companies are groundbreaking. We study his documentation methods, his approach to gathering evidence under dangerous circumstances. He saved a lot of lives, ma'am. After Agent Chen left, I walked through the training facility that had once been my family's mountain retreat. The main house now served as classrooms and offices. The basement, thoroughly decontaminated and rebuilt, housed a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory. Michael's bedroom had been converted into a library specializing in financial crime research. It was peaceful here now. The poisonous atmosphere Stephanie had created was gone, replaced by the energy of young agents learning to fight the kind of evil my son had uncovered. Linda? Agent Santos appeared in the doorway. She had been promoted to Deputy Director of Financial Crimes and oversaw the training program. Ready for the ceremony? I nodded, following her to the main conference room where the graduation was being held. 24 new agents were completing their specialized training in financial crime investigation. Each of them had studied Michael's case in detail. As Agent Santos spoke to the graduating class, I thought about how much had changed since that terrible day when I'd inherited nothing but Michael's old Honda. The investigation sparked by his evidence had resulted in 127 arrests across 9 states. 43 people were currently serving prison sentences, including all 12 women who had been part of Stephanie's Black Widow network. The financial assets seized in the operation totaled over $400 million. More importantly, the drug manufacturing operation housed in my family's basement had been responsible for supplying fentanyl to dealers across the western United States. Shutting it down had saved an estimated 3,000 lives over the past 2 years, but the personal victories meant just as much. 18 families like mine had finally received answers about the deaths of their loved ones. Justice had been served for men who had died believing their wives loved them, never knowing they were being slowly murdered for money. After the ceremony, I drove to the small cemetery where Michael was buried. I'd had his headstone updated 6 months ago. It now read, Michael David Hayes, beloved son, FBI hero. He died protecting others. I placed fresh flowers on his grave and sat on the bench beside it, a ritual I'd maintained every month for 2 years. The last appeals were denied, I told him quietly. Stephanie will die in prison. So will Tony Markelli and the rest of them. They'll never hurt anyone again. The late afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees overhead. It was peaceful here, with mountains visible in the distance and the sound of a creek running nearby. Agent Santos thinks I should write a book about what you discovered. Tell the story so other families know what to watch for. I pulled out the letter he'd left for me at Mountain View, now worn soft from being read so many times. I think you'd like that idea. Helping people even after everything's over. I'd been considering Agent Santos's suggestion for months. Publishers had contacted me after news of the case became public. They wanted to tell the story of how a retired teacher had brought down a criminal empire with evidence her son had hidden in an old camera. But it wasn't really my story. It was Michael's. He was the one who had figured out what Stephanie was doing. He was the one who had risked everything to document her crimes. He was the one who had died trying to protect innocent people. If I wrote the book, it would be his story. A story about ordinary courage, about a man who chose to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah, the young woman from Michael's accounting firm who had helped me find his evidence. We'd stayed in touch over the past 2 years, bonding over our shared determination to see justice done. Saw the news about the appeals. It's really over now. Want to get coffee tomorrow and celebrate? I typed back. Yes, I have something to tell you about a book project. Sarah had become like a daughter to me during the investigation and trial. She'd left the accounting firm and gone back to school to study criminal justice, inspired by Michael's example. She was graduating next month and had already been accepted to the FBI Academy. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I noticed an older man standing by a grave several rows away. He looked familiar, and after a moment, I recognized him. Frank Morrison, whose son Robert had been one of Stephanie's earlier victims in California. I walked over to him. Mr. Morrison? I'm Linda Hayes. We met during the trial. His face brightened with recognition. Mrs. Hayes, of course. How are you doing? I'm well. How about you? He gestured toward the headstone he'd been visiting. "This is Robert. I finally had his body exhumed and brought here to Colorado. Seemed fitting, since this is where justice was finally served." I looked at the gravestone. Robert Daniel Morrison, loving son and father, victim of evil, vindicated by truth. He had a daughter, Frank continued. Emma. She's 15 now. Lives with her mother in California. For years, she thought her father died of natural causes. Now she knows he was murdered, but she also knows his killer is in prison forever. We stood together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two parents who had lost their sons to the same evil, but had lived to see justice done. "Your boy was remarkable," Frank said finally. Robert never knew what was happening to him, but Michael figured it out and fought back. He saved my granddaughter from ever having to wonder if her father's killer would come for her too. After Frank left, I sat back down on the bench beside Michael's grave. The sun was setting now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple that reminded me of the sunsets we used to watch together from Mountain View's front porch when he was young. "I've decided to write the book," I told him. "Sarah's going to help me. We'll make sure people understand what you did, why you did it, and how they can protect themselves from people like Stephanie." I pulled out my phone and called Agent Santos. "Linda, is everything all right? I want to write the book," I said, "but I want to do it right. I want it to help people recognize the warning signs, protect themselves from financial predators. Can the FBI help with that?" "Absolutely. We've been hoping you'd decide to tell this story. There are so many families who could benefit from knowing what Michael discovered." "Then let's do it. For Michael." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing the first chapter. I started with the day I inherited Michael's Honda Civic, the day that seemed like the end of everything, but turned out to be the beginning of justice. As I wrote, I could almost feel Michael's presence beside me, guiding my words and helping me tell his story. The story of an ordinary man who did extraordinary things when faced with evil. The story of love, courage, and the power of truth to triumph over the darkest corruption. Outside my window, the city lights twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there, other families were living normal lives, unaware of the dangers that people like Stephanie posed. But now, thanks to Michael's sacrifice and the book I was going to write, they would have the knowledge they needed to protect themselves. I wrote until dawn, the words flowing easily as I remembered my son's life, his character, his final heroic act. When I finished the first chapter, I read it aloud to the empty kitchen, imagining Michael listening. "How's that, sweetheart?" I asked the silence. In the growing morning light, I could swear I heard his voice, proud and loving. "Perfect, Mom. Just perfect." I had lost my son, but I had gained a mission. Michael's story would help protect other families from the evil we had faced. His legacy would be measured not just in the criminals he had helped convict, but in the lives his story would save. It was, I realized, exactly what he would have wanted. Justice served, evil defeated, and other people protected from harm. For the first time since Michael's death, I felt completely at peace. 3 months later, I held the first printed copy of The Camera Never Lies, A Mother's Fight for Justice. The dedication read, "For Michael David Hayes, who chose courage over safety and truth over silence, your legacy lives on in every family protected by your story." The book became a bestseller within weeks, but more importantly, it became a tool for education and protection. Police departments used it to train officers in recognizing financial crimes. Families shared it to learn the warning signs of predatory relationships. Social workers distributed it to help vulnerable people protect themselves. And every month, I continued to visit Michael's grave, bringing him updates on the lives his story was saving and the criminals it was helping to catch. My son had wanted to be remembered as someone who protected others. Mission accomplished.